morning, everyone, and welcome to the 5th tutorial in this series. And this is specifically to help people with their assignments for the collection management and curation training course. But it also can provide guidance if you're not part of the course, but if you're implementing the manual. So in our last two topics, we covered the risk assessment and risk evaluation and risk mitigation processes. And this one is about disaster and emergency response planning. And the assignment is quite short and concise, but obviously if you were doing this properly, you would have a very full emergency and disaster response plan, which could be pages and pages and pages. So what we've asked, and this is really just a summary, and if institutions even just had this in place and were using it, I think that there would be it would be hugely helpful. So I think let me just share my screen and we can get started. All right. Okay. So this emergency disaster response plan for this tutorial, it's assignment 5. And for this assignment, we asked, does your institution have an emergency or disaster response plan? I think most organizations will have something, but it might not cover collections. So the first step in the assignment is really to look, do we have this in our institution? And if you're in a big institution like a university, the university might have something, but it doesn't specifically mention anything about collections. And so that would be a gap that would need to be addressed. So the first step is to look at if you've got something, then the second step is to say, does it include our collections? Because they would need quite different treatment if there was a disaster, or there may be disasters that just happen in the collections. Or an emergency might be specific to the collections. And if you don't have any plan, then the assignment is to start from scratch and develop a pocket response plan. Okay, so if you have a plan, does it cover collections, and maybe use that plan to condense it down into a pocket response plan. If you have nothing, then you're going to develop a pocket response plan and focus on the collections that you're responsible for. And it's to focus specifically on the main disasters that are likely to occur in your collection. So just a reminder, the difference between an emergency and a disaster. So an emergency is an unanticipated or threatening event that requires immediate action. And a disaster is once that emergency gets out of control, it becomes a disaster. So they're two distinct things. So obviously you should really be able to intervene at the stage where it's an emergency, something happens, it's a threat. It hasn't yet caused massive damage. So you intervene when there's an emergency and you prevent damage. But sometimes that's not possible, and that emergency runs away and gets out of control. And then it's a large-scale calamity that requires immediate action. So you still have to do something once you've had a disaster. It can result in significant loss, damage, or destruction, either to the collections or to your infrastructure, to your building, to your IT systems. And there's natural disasters and there's man-made disasters. So in the last webinar and the last tutorial, as part of the webinar number 4, we looked at the 5 stages of control for risks, and The first one was to avoid, then block, then detect, and that's all in your risk management. But sometimes you can't do all of those things, and sometimes you need to respond when a risk is happening. And that's where we're looking at today. So planning, preparation, and effective actions. So you're responding when something happens, and sometimes it's not possible to respond effectively, and then you have to recover from the damage and the loss. So we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at salvage because we're just focusing on that pocket response plan, which is your assignment. So just to think back to the webinar when we did that, we looked at the different kinds of disasters. And, you know, the chances of these kinds of things happening are increasing all the time. So you see more and more and more of them. And so to think that it can't happen or it will never happen in your institution or your environment is actually unrealistic. There's a good chance that it could happen. All of these places that we're going to show also probably thought it wouldn't ever happen, but it did. So earthquake followed by severe storms, so those would be disasters. In Beirut, they had that massive chemical explosion that really created massive damage to buildings. Floods in Germany, so caused by heavy rainfall, flooded documents. We know about the Brazilian fire in their Museum of Natural History. It created massive loss. I was in a meeting the other day about onychophora, so velvet worms for people who don't know. And we were talking about the type specimens, and a whole lot of them were lost in this Brazilian fire. So it has an impact on research, and we were talking about red listing. And now, of course, no one can ever go back and check what the identity of those was. And that was because they, you know, at that museum, they didn't have proper maintenance. And that, I think, is a situation a lot of us who work in old buildings will find. You know, they're not regular inspections by the fire department. And, you know, there's no fire inspection report, there's no fire and panic safety protocols. You might have an emergency plan, but it's not put into practice. So all of these, you know, these issues are things that we could have to deal with. We should be prepared for them. Lots of fire, and you'll know, I mean, in our country, that Charlotte Maxeke Hospital having a fire, Parliament having a massive fire in January, and globally this is an issue as well. Glasgow School of Art after its second fire, Berlin's Humboldt Forum, and these are in major cities globally, Delhi Museum, Notre Dame in Paris, and then our own UCT, that big fire that happened. And, you know, we had a presentation by Dean from Bolus Herbarium, and he explained that it was actually, there was nothing that could have worked to stop that fire getting into that building. You know, if they'd had sprinklers, if they'd had a gas suppression system, it wouldn't have mattered. It was so vicious that nothing could have stopped it. But then you have to have your disaster response plan. And fortunately, they had a very good response plan, and they were able to implement it quickly. You know, robberies, Museum Africa in Joburg. So part of the roof was stolen, then there was flood. You know, it's just more and more and more. So, you know, if you're on a university campus, there's potential protesting students at UKZN, they burned the law library, and lots of documents were either burned or impacted by the water from putting the fires out. You know, the protests, or whatever you want to call them, that happened in July in and in Gauteng last year. We were very lucky that those came close to a couple of our institutions. So it's evident that you have to have a plan, and that plan has to be carefully thought through and practiced, and there has to be training. So in an emergency or disaster response plan, you need details of the teams, so their position, their roles and responsibilities. And in the manual and in various other resources, it gives you a breakdown of what you include, what kinds of roles and what are their responsibilities. And those should be assigned, whether it's in your collection or at an institutional level. Now, for some of you, you might say, well, I don't know all of these people and what they would do. I'm just I don't deal with things at that level. So if you don't know the names of people, then you can just put the positions. Then the other aspect that's really important is the decision-making and leadership. So who reports to who? And this is really important, because if you don't know who takes decisions and who, what your reporting lines are, it can create chaos. People can be held responsible for doing the wrong thing, or doing things that are not their responsibility. It should have been done by somebody else. A very important one here is who communicates with the media, and who's got the authority to do that. So it's very important to know who makes the decisions, instructs, and who instructs, and who authorizes different actions. You can't have everybody running around making decisions and telling everybody what to do. It will be complete chaos. So that's a very important part of your emergency response or your disaster response. And then a contact list, so list of all the emergency response teams. So again, you might not have everybody's cell phone numbers. It's fine. You can make up something if you don't want, obviously you might not want to put out people's cell phone numbers for the course. And so you could use, just use 000 if you don't want to do that. But in your real plan, you need these phone numbers and contact details. And then all your local fire department, the police, your security company, your ambulance service, and it might be your state ambulance, and you can also include a private ambulance service. And here you might just need to use Google. So you might say, well, I don't know what the phone number, I don't know where to get hold of the ambulance. Use Google. You'll find the information there. And then for your proper full emergency response plan, you'd have a whole inventory of all your collections. But for this, we're really just asking for the list of prioritized collections with their location. So a floor plan would be very useful, but if you don't have that, then you don't have to put it in. But you need to say on the 3rd floor, room 206, in wing whatever of the whatever building. And the prioritized collections would be your type collection, very rare specimens. I mean, people might say, well, all of our material is rare, but you will have some things that are very, very special. And those would be your priority to get out of the building if there was a disaster or an emergency even. So those would be the things that you would first protect. So those will go into your response. So the things in orange here are the ones that are going to go into your pocket response plan. A list of materials and supplies for an emergency supply cart, that will go into your full plan, but we don't need that now for the pocket response. And then something that we do need is a list of service providers to assist in an emergency. So, you know, if something happens and you can respond very quickly, you haven't got time to sit and Google and try and find companies. What if all your electricity is down, or internet connection is down? Then you're really stuck. And so that's why on your pocket response, your really critical information is, who do we contact to help us out here? So is there somewhere you could store your collections on a temporary basis? Is there somebody who could help you with freezing on a temporary basis? If all your lights were down, your electricity was down, you might have to move things off-site to be frozen, or bring in a truck, you know, one of those freezing trucks. So you've got to find out who could do this, who could help with cleanup and salvage efforts. So this is really an important step as well. So if you've had a flood, are there companies that help you to clean up after a flood? And remember, there might be lots of sludge and mud all over everything. It might not be possible for you to do it yourself in-house. It might be, but it's better to have some information available. And then also you could include other institutions that could help. So is there another museum or herbarium close by who might be able to come in and help you? Have their contact details? Again, here you use Google to help you find those kinds of companies. And then you also need to identify where you would put collections if a particular collection room was flooded, or there'd been a fire and you had to salvage and move material out, either to prevent it from being damaged, or if it was damaged and you needed to restore it, where would you put it? You can't leave it where it is. So to think about, where do we have a space in the building? It's really important to do that in advance, because if you're running around in a panic, you might make the wrong decision or not be able to find anything. So for the pocket response plan, we're not worrying about the procedures for evacuation. Obviously, that would all be in your full plan. But there is a requirement to look at the response for various types of emergencies and salvaging collection objects. And the specifics of the collection and accompanying risks will need to be taken into consideration, and we'll look at that. So these are the things in orange that will go into that pocket response plan. And the green that I've put there is just some guidance, just to help you if you're really stuck and don't know where to start. So what we're asking for this assignment is a pocket emergency response plan. So this is something that's used globally, just to condense the information so that if people have it in their pockets, in their wallet, in their bag with all their stuff, and if they need information at hand, they don't have to go and grab a huge fat file and be looking through it to try and find everything. Or a lot of institutions might have their full disaster plan on computers, and what happens if you can't access your computer. So this is really just the most critical information all put onto 2 pages. And there's a template, and we have provided that template for you. So this is a PDF, and if you Google this, if you Google a pocket response plan for collections, you'll find a whole lot of different templates. They're all very similar, and some of them are popular, you know, they've got information on for a particular collection, others don't. So this first side of that pocket response plan includes all the contact details of people. And some of them that, because this was developed in America, it might, some of the terms that they use might not be appropriate. And you can always just delete those. So who's the director or who's the head of your institution? Who would be ultimately responsible for everything. This can be a director, it can be the head of a department, it can be a dean, who's the second in charge, and then who's the emergency manager. So for your institution, who is responsible for emergencies? And it might not be a name, but it might be a position. So it might be the chief operating officer, chief operations officer. But you need to think about who would it be in my institution. And then here they've got financial services or accountant, but who is the head of the money? Who controls the money in your institution? So here it might be your chief finance officer, not your accountant or financial services, but it would be who has to authorize payment for anything. And then security, who's head of security in your organization? Who's responsible? Again, it might be a chief operations officer, it might be the CEO, it might be the director, might not have a security person. And then who's responsible for health and safety? So ours might be the occupational health and safety. So do you have an occupational health and safety or health and safety officer, manager? Who deals with that? And then they call it janitorial services, but you might call it, so these are the people who are responsible for cleaning. And they can play a very important role. I think when Jermaine gave us an example of flooding at their institution, they ran and looked for the cleaning people to come and help them because they had all the cleaning equipment, the mops and everything. You couldn't find them. So who's in charge of those cleaning people? And it might be an external company or it might be internal. And then there's your risk manager. Do you have a risk manager for your institution? Again, it might be your director or your CEO. Insurance, who's responsible for insurance in your institution? And your public relations officer. So this might not be a public relations officer, but it might be your communications. I think at Sandy, we've got a communications outreach director, and they are responsible for all media liaison and media communicating with the outside world, especially in terms of media. In charge of your IT, so who, if there's a problem with IT, who takes responsibility? And this one, registrar special collections. So I'm not sure what kind of person you would have in your institution. But I think this would be the person who's really responsible for the collections in your institution overall. Then you should have a disaster team. Who's the team leader for disaster? And then you'll have members of that team. Then you've got to think about the building utilities. Who's responsible for water and fire suppression system related to water in the building? Who's responsible for the water? They call it potable water, but this would be your water supply. So it would probably be your municipality. The contact details for your plumber. And if you don't have, so, I think with procurement, a lot of institutions have a contracted plumber. Maybe you've got your own plumber. Maybe you're that fortunate. So maybe the big universities or big institutions have a plumber and your electrician. So these people could be really critical to know who to contact. And gas, I don't know, in America, they have a lot of gas systems, and I don't know that we do. Who's not the telephone number, but who's responsible for the telephone? So if your phones go down, then who's the contact for that? The Telcom, you might have somebody else. And the same, your lifts or your elevators, who's responsible for those? Your security system, so if you have alarms, do you have an armed response? Do you have on-site security people? And then your fire suppression, who's responsible? So I know at Sandy in the National Herbarium, there is a company, I can't remember what they're called, but they are, if there's a problem, we call them, we don't deal with it ourselves. And then your first responders, so these are obviously really important. What's the phone number for your local fire departments? For your medical emergencies, so your ambulances. And here, like I said, it might be good to put 2. So your state, your whoever's might be a municipal one or a provincial one, but then also include Netcare or one of the other private ambulance services. The police department, the city emergency management. So this is something you should be able to pick up on the internet. If you go to your municipality, that I would hope that they have a website, and there you'd be able to find out who do you contact if there's an emergency. And it's probably required that if it's quite a big thing, like a big flood or a fire, that you have to inform your municipality. And county, well, for us, that would be province. If it's something that could have a provincial level impact, you might have to contact the province as well, and the provincial health departments. So those things you should be able to find on the internet. And then national resource contact. So in America, they've got something called FEMA. It's the Federal Emergency Management something. We have a national disaster management unit. It falls under Kochter, and they do have a website, but I think they mostly deal with emergencies or disasters at a national level. But there you can also see there's a legislation, so there is law that governs disasters. But yours might be a small thing, you know, an emergency. If your one storeroom is flooded by a leaking pipe, that's not a national disaster, it's not a provincial disaster, it's not even a municipal level disaster. But sometimes something might be considered a national disaster. All right, and then your emergency recovery. So conservative specialization. So if you have paper collections, then you might need to know, well, who's the specialist? Is there somebody that we contact for rescuing paper? It might be for wet skins. It might be for crushed fossils. It might be to prevent mold on skins. So who are these specialized people who would be able to help us? And then a refrigerated trucking service. So often the best thing to do is to freeze wet specimens or even burnt specimens, because that stops any further deterioration. But you might not have enough freezer space. And so can you get a trucking service that has freezers? And also the other option is to move your collections that are wet or damaged into a company that has freezer storage. So you can Google that and see if you can find service providers. A commercial recovery service, so for dehumidification, for freeze drying, for drying out anything else, look for these kinds of service providers. There might be ones that clean up after fire. data recovery service. So if all your IT systems are flooded or burnt, then what would you do with your machines? Industrial hygienist, so this would be really important to know who would do the testing to see whether it's safe for us to go back into the collection at different stages. So people who do mold testing and look for any other toxins, so these would have to be a professional company. Fumigation, so you might have pest infestations if the building has stood for a long time after a fire. So I think if you just think about Parliament, I don't know, I mean, they've not really been allowing people in. Have the rats gone in? Have the cockroaches gone in? And then a structural architect. So again, you might need, and you know, for Parliament, they've had to have all kinds of engineers look at whether that structure is still sound. And I heard, the last I heard it, they're worried that it might not be sound. So you might have others that you want to include. You can add them, but these are the really critical contacts. And then your regional contacts. So here, check whether there is they look for that national emergency and provincial and anybody else. So we don't have, so I don't know that SARMA, and maybe one of you would know, like, would SARMA be able, the South African Museums Association, or SARA, be able to help you if you had a disaster? It would be interesting to hear if anybody knows about that. But those are the kinds of organizations that could potentially help you, as well as the NSCF. So obviously, if there was a disaster, we would see how, if there was some way that we could help as the NSCF hub team, or connections that we might have. And mutual aid partners. So this would really be who would be able to help you. Who else? Is there anybody else that would help you? A network of volunteers, international organization. So just to think, if we did have a major disaster, who would help us? Who would be able to? Who would we be able to call on? Like UCT did with theirs. Who would we be able to call on? Okay, I'm going to stop there and let's just see if there are any questions about what we've covered. You can put your hand up or just ask. Does anybody know about SAMA, the South African Museums Association, if they have an emergency or disaster help section, or SARA? Andrea?
Michelle, no, sorry, I'm just with our disaster plan. I don't know anything about the SAMA, but I just wanted to comment on the pocket plan that we did. I've got a lot of things missing. I wasn't aware that we actually had to put in our floor plan. So I'll include that in the pocket plan. And then also I'll see on our pocket plan, it mentions that we must grab our type collections first, but I haven't actually indicated where on the floor plan they are. So that I still need to add. But I think only used your templates. Thank you. That was a huge help. So we filled in the gaps. Honestly, it didn't have one. So ours is basically the first one that's been put together here.
Did you have a full emergency plan or disaster plan?
No, there wasn't one available at all.
Yeah, so I think that's quite common. So, you know, that's the thing, that to do that full plan, I think will take, you know, that you really, if you're doing it for real, you'll have to get quite a lot of people together and you'll have to think out everything. And that could take a lot of time. And so I think that just having this pocket response plan is worthwhile doing it quickly, because you never know, that disaster might happen next week.
Yeah.
You know, so I think it's important step. And did you manage to, how did you find all these contacts? Did you?
The contacts, well, we used your template, and then we've got Honor Support has got a telephone list, and then I also Googled to get the local fire brigade and things like that as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good. So let's have a look at the next page. So that's all your contacts, and you can see how valuable it will be to just have them at hand. And then the other side of your pocket response plan is your action. So what do? You're in a big panic, there's a fire, there's a flood. What do? You pull out your pocket response plan and it will give you some guidance. So this breaks it down into different sections. So your immediate response and checklist for collections recovery. So what do you do immediately? So your notification. So obviously the first thing is to get the right people, your first responders, notified. So you've got to make sure that you tell all the relevant staff and visitors. You've got to make sure that they are safe. And like if there's a fire, it might be that evacuation, and you're not doing the evacuation plan here, but you would obviously need to have one and follow that. So making sure that there can't be any harm to them. You've got to look at your institutional contacts and see who do I contact here. And of course, it will depend on what kind of an emergency or disaster there is. You've got to notify the relevant building people, and you've got to then activate the disaster plans, emergency response actions. So what do you actually physically do? And you've got to obviously get the disaster team working and follow the other communication steps. So your assessment, the first thing is to assess the situation. So you first make sure everybody's safe, you notify who you have to, and then you look to see what it is, what's happened, how severe is it. Protect your staff, and then you've got to document things. You've got to take photos, videos, make notes of the situation. You've got to assess the damage. So what kind of an emergency was it? So it could be, fire, smoke, chemical, clean water, dirty water, heat, humidity. So what's the situation now? And then what areas are affected? So you document that, how much of the collection is damaged, what types of materials are damaged, and are critical information systems functional or safe. So that's your first just do your assessment of the damage. And then your communication. So you've got a whole communication channel, and this tells you what to do. So you might think, okay, so it's all there already. What do I need to do for my assignments? This tells me what to do. The thing is to you'll see at the bottom here, there's a response section, which is the specifics for different situations. So the top bit is the general kind of thing that you would do, and then the bottom is the more specific for a particular kind of emergency or disaster. So yeah, so then it tells you all your communication. So you have to contact all these people. And it's a very useful guideline for you to sort of go through. And then your collection salvage. So what do you do? You've got to get your emergency supplies. Then you've got to identify secure dry locations. So where would you put if you need to move specimens or collections, where are you going to put them? You've got to get your volunteers and your staff together, and then you've got to follow a salvage procedure that has been worked out. So you've got to have a salvage plan, and you've got to follow that, because you can't think of, you can't, you know, if there's a flood, it'll be a different salvage procedure to if it's fire damage or some other kind of damage. Sanela Siwe?
Morning, Michelle and the rest of the network. I just had a question here for things like, you know, like gas, okay? So let's say in whatever existing documents, right? No one has thought as far as gas or some other supply, for example, the trucks, you know, I don't think anyone has thought of that, right? So given that not everybody worked in groups, right? Will there be, I don't know, some form of penalty, or does it not reflect positively if you guys have listed different suppliers for that thing?
Yeah, I think everybody's going to have different on, you know, a different looking sheet with different information. And so there's no like one right answer for this. It'll vary depending on your collection type and the most likely disasters and what's available. I mean, you know, if you in like Nikisha, who sits in Skukuza with her collection, the service provider she would be able to get quickly may be very limited. And she, you know, you've got to think about what would be realistic for my organization, for my situation and where I am. So it might be that sometimes it's just there's no refrigerated freezer truck thing that I can find, and we can't have that then. It might not be an option.
Michelle,
About thinking through. All right.
Yeah, no, Michelle, I meant specifically if you guys are in one institution and you're probably looking at, yes, at a similar or the very same collection, but one goes and picks a particular gas company, maybe because it's national, right? Another one will pick it because maybe it's more widely known. I'm just saying that for the same thing, you choose different suppliers, but your selection criteria is, you know, different, like your reasons for selecting them are different. So now that's why I'm asking, now does that like reflect badly, blah, 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 yeah.
So I understand. Sorry, I didn't understand what you were asking there. So if you've got 3 people in the same institution and they've all done this and they've got different suppliers, I don't think that that's a big deal at this stage. Obviously, when you do the proper manual implementation, you will have to work together, and then you would be able to look and you could compare what you came up with, and you could you could agree on which, or you could put all of your suppliers, but we're not going to fuss about it now for the assignment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, so your collection salvage, you've got to think through carefully, and then here is your collection priorities. What is your first priority collection? So what is the most critical thing for you to rescue? Your second priority, so once we've rescued that, what's the next one? Are there really important documents or files or external hard drives that have very important information? Have we got equipment that would be very hard to replace and we can rescue it, even if it means moving it to another room? So, you know, it might be your scanning electron microscope. If the room is flooded, it might be that we have to get that thing out because we would struggle without it. And then anything else that you think is really important to rescue. Okay, then it talks about a map, where a map of the building is. So if you don't have a map of the building or a site plan for your whole institution, then don't worry too much about it. I mean, obviously for implementing this, it would be very important to have it, because that's the kind of thing that you would give to the fire department if they came, or to anybody else, one of those first responders, or if you have volunteers, even your insurance company, to be able to show them where the damage is. So a map of the building and a map of the collection. So especially to show where your types are. So even if you don't have like a professional one, maybe just do like a sketch and include that, just showing where the priority collections are in your building or in the collection room. But just if you just do a sketch, I think Andrea said she didn't have this yet, but it can be a sketch. It's better than having nothing. Okay, and then here is your major disaster incident and command systems. Let me just make that a bit bigger. I should have made it bigger. So who's responsible for overall management of the incident? The public information officer is responsible for communication with the media and public. So you should know, I do not talk to ENCA, I do not talk to the Sunday Times. Somebody else does that. The safety officer, who's the safety officer that monitors the safety of the incident in regards to both the facility and the responder. So somebody has to take responsibility for the safety of everybody on site. There's a liaison officer to coordinate with representatives of the cooperating agencies. Planning section chief prepares the incident action plan to respond to the event. There's an operations section chief, ensures that the incident action plan is enacted. Logistics section chief. So for you, there might be like 2 people who do all of this, but it's important to know which are those 2 people. Is it the director? Is it the chief operating officer? Is it the who is it in your institution? Who would do all of these things? And who does all the finance stuff? Who would make those decisions? And then, you know, you might not have to do this. You might not have to speak to insurance and emergency response, but these are what people would ask. Who's in charge here? There's been a fire. Who's in charge? Who would be in charge? What is the safety status? Is it safe here? What has happened and the cause? What are the hazards? So this you don't have to put anything in your plan. These are the questions that will be in your emergency, your pocket response. It's just for people to think through when there's been an emergency or disaster. You have to everyone should know this. What has been done so far? Can the staff handle the situation initially? Do we need to move anything? And who's handling the media? So those are just questions for you to think through. You don't have to put anything in your emergency response. All right, so what we're asking you is to have here at the bottom, water response. So pick 2 or 3 of the most likely emergencies or disasters that could happen to your collection where you are. Fire is an obvious one. I think for all of the institutions, fire would have come up as your biggest risk, because if it happens and it's not controlled, there's a very high likelihood that you would lose your entire collection. So it's a very, very high priority risk. Flooding is another one, because it can happen so easily with burst water pipes, damaged roof in a storm and flooding from that. And even as a consequence of fire. So, you know, we heard about the Parliament fire, and of course they used a lot of water to extinguish that fire, and the archival documents got all wet. And I think that was also at UCT. So the water is a big risk as well, water damage from whatever source. And you might have something else, some other kind of a risk. or something that's a high priority, but at least 2. So you can do your water response and also your fire response. So what would you do if there was a flood? Stop the source, remove standing water. These are your immediate response. So what do? Immediately? You stop the source, you remove standing water, you cover the collections with plastic sheeting, you remove materials from the water path, you move books, this is for a library, you move books higher on shelves or onto book trucks. And then under your assessment, if you've had a water response, identify materials needing immediate salvage action. So what do you need to do immediately? It's which ones do we need to do something to, and what do we need to do to stabilize the environment immediately? Do we need to open windows? What do we need to do? And then for your communication, so quick response is essential to prevent mold growth and irreversible damage to materials. So here they quickly phone the refrigerator trucks and the freezer storage and get that organized. And then under the collection salvage, what they've put here, we've got to stop mold, and we're going to get staff and volunteers to load our priority materials into the freezer based on material type. We're going to organize our staff and volunteers to air dry material that should not be frozen. So there's your salvage response. So you might have water and fire, and you do it for your particular kind of collection. And that's it. That's your response plan. Just see. So something you might be unsure about what to put in. If you just look on the internet, template for pocket response plan for this is for plant collections, so it's for living collections, but you can look at, they might have something there for preserved plants as well, for herbaria. There's this Collections Trust, it's a UK organization. They've got a whole pocket salvage guide, and it gives for health and safety, water damage, fire damage, stabilizing by freezing, air drying, different collection types covered, it's all there. What else I found? There's an article on developing an emergency response plan for natural history collections. It's quite an old document, but a lot of it will still be relevant. So there's a lot of information on the internet. So if you're really stuck and you don't know, I've got a wet collection, so an ethanol collection. What on earth would I do if there was a fire? You know, I don't know. So you can do research on it. Let me just go back to this and just give you some more hints. Yeah, so you're going to pick your 2 or 3 emergencies and use the manual. So the NSCF Collection Management Curation Manual has quite a lot of guidance about what to do in different kinds of emergencies. And that, you know, that can be things like vandalism. It can be a robbery. It can be a hostage situation, but prioritize things that are related to the collections. But what if your collection was vandalized? What would you do? So there's lots of information in the manual. There's information about salvage. But if you can't find things that you need that are in the manual, then do research. So there's lots of information on the internet. Look at the emergency response plans and disaster response and salvage plans that other institutions have on the internet. So you're obviously not going to just copy directly. You have to go through it and pull out things that are relevant to your situation and appropriate for your situation and your type of collection. And I think that that's it. Yeah. All right. So let's stop sharing there and let's see if there's any questions, comments, anybody who's worked on this assignment and had any problems. Bernard?
Hi, Michelle. I guess one of the real issues is to what level should staff be putting themselves at risk when it comes to these things? I mean, you mentioned those wet collections of yours. You need to know whether, if there's a fire, whether you should stay away or should you be rushing in to the rooms that aren't burning yet and removing the type specimens, when maybe you and I don't know that the fumes would burn and spread within seconds. And, you know, fires are things that really concern me when I see how quickly they happen, when, you know, that whole thing of going up to a door and feeling if the door's hot or not before you open it. And yeah, I mean, my instinct is I want to rush in and save all my type specimens. That's one thing when there's water, because I know I can swim and all the rest of it. But when there's a fire, you know, or an explosion or whatever the case may be, it's tricky.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a good question. Let's see. Has anybody had experience or with a fire or got their plan together as part of the assignment or the exercise? I mean, what would you do if there was a fire in a collection room and let's say it was a wet collection with ethanol? Andrea, what did you do fire for your, did you think about fire for your collections?
Yeah, we did do fire, but not in such detail. You know, it's to notify the authorities if it's safe to do so, but I mean, you never quite know if it really is safe, like these fumes, for instance. And then also our collections are in really heavy cabinets, and they're not on wheels, so you can't wheelie the thing out the room. So it will be trying to grab what you can, and obviously not run, because all our things are in glass. So I didn't put that much thought into this. I'll have to go back and redo some of these things.
No, I think that's, so, you know, I think if you look at that emergency response, the pocket plan, one of the first things is about safety, people's safety, staff and visitors. And the first thing is to ensure that they're safe. And then you're not going to have people who are not trained making any decision about whether you can go into a room, whether you should run and grab types. You know what I mean? There should be procedures, and that may not be in your pocket response plan. But your emergency response team leader or whoever else is responsible in the circumstances would make that decision. So it's not the decision of a technician who has no experience or training or anything. You can't make that decision. That's why your roles and responsibilities and who takes the decisions is such a critical aspect, because there's lives, there could be lives lost. And so you can't have people thinking, should I do this? Should I go and fetch my types? It may not be your responsibility. You may not have the authority. And if somebody get out of the building, there's a big risk. You have to listen to them. If it's the team leader or whoever's responsible for an emergency and they tell you to get out, you've got to get out. And yeah, I think you don't put yourself, if there's a risk to your life, you don't take that risk as much as you want to. So Nelisi, did you have a question or a comment?
It was going to be basically answering the question. At the KZN Herbarium, we do have like a fire team that would be responsible for that, and we do the fire drills and stuff. So we know that we need to, you know, all meet up at the assembly point and, You're not trying to grab anything. You just need to be safe. I'm sure a person would want to grab maybe stuff that's on their desk, you know, if it's worth saving, like external hard drives and things like that. But the immediate thing is for you to go and, you know, meet at the assembly point. I always tell them one thing, which is the same thing I would say now, Michelle, especially with reference to the ethanol within the wet collection. It's not my responsibility because there is somebody doing that. But if it were my responsibility, I would be calling the fire department from the other side of the road, like outside the building, outside, like already crossed the road and stuff, like as far away as possible from the site of danger. Bernard seems to maybe not agree.
Yeah. No, I mean, your people's life is more important at the end of the day. You can't risk somebody losing their life to save a type specimen. You can't. Bernard?
Yeah, because essentially type specimens, the only people who would be qualified or know what to remove would be the curators, collection staff. It's not going to be the fire department or the ambulance services. So it would be a very fine line. And I see there was a question on whether people have multiple tasks. Now, in our department, I'm in charge of first aid. Sefalazi is in charge of fire or emergency evacuation plan. So if something goes askew here, we will be busy. Our priority is to focus on essentially health and safety of people. And then there's nobody left to think about collections. So it's quite a difficult one. And I think it's a good exercise, because we'd have to think about people first. And then if there's time and safety enough, it's the collections. But other than that, I can see things go up in smoke and whatever else, and there's very little one can do. It sounds terribly negative.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very limited to what we can do.
Yes, so absolutely. So yes, I see Rendani's asked, can one person have many roles in the emergency or management plan? Yes, they can. And in a small organization, they probably will have to have many roles. You're not going to have enough people for everyone to just have one role. So usually there would be, like Bernard has said, so, the evacuation, so somebody's responsible for getting everybody out of the building. Someone else will be responsible for making a decision about whether it's safe. So if the fire is at one end of the building and your types are at the other end, you really want to get them out. Somebody has to be delegated that responsibility for taking that decision. And it might be 2 or 3 people together, but it's not everybody as an individual's decision. You'd have to know in advance, and they would have to have had some kind of training. So they might think or know, based on what they've seen, that the chances of that fire spreading to the other part of the building are very low, and you've got half an hour and you can get in and get what you need out. And they would say, okay, to this group of people who've been trained in fire, they will be the ones who will go and fetch. And that's where you need your plans, so that they know where the types are. You can show them on the map, and you would say, get these things out, but you've only got half an hour, and then pull them out. So that's why it's so important to have all of this documented, to have thought through it, to know who's responsible, who will take the decisions. And for the staff to all know that. Everybody should know who takes the decisions like that. And you don't all run and be trying to rescue things. I think in that Brazil fire, you did see they formed chains, human chains, to be passing specimens out while the building was burning. But it was obviously managed. It wasn't just everybody running, grabbing. They organized themselves. They got everybody there, even though it was night, and they were taking things out. But yeah, the first priority is the health and safety of people. All right. Any other comments or questions on this? think it is a really important exercise. It makes you think through things. It's too late once that disaster is happening. You don't have time to think this through, and there's risk to people and to the collections. All right, so if there's nothing else, I think we can end there. Good luck with that assignment. Like I said, there's lots on the internet. Go and Google, look, read the manual, and see what you can find. And this afternoon, we've got the health and safety assignment tutorial as well. So thanks, everybody. Bye.